Hello everyone, my name is Luís Preto, I'm Portuguese and I've been the National Technical Director for the Portuguese Federation of Jogo do Pau for 6 years, and now I'm very happy to be here to shoot this instructional DVD.
Hello, I'm Lee Smith, Principal Instructor of Blood and Iron Martial Arts. I'm also the current Director of Curriculum for the HEMA Alliance. So Louis, what's the goal for this video today? What do you want to show?
I want to use this DVD in order to share what we know of how pairing skill evolved within Jogo do Pau, and hopefully use these concepts to shed a different light and a different point of view in the interpretation of historical fencing, European historical fencing.
So Louis, what exactly is Jogo do Pau?
So the thing is that Jogo do Pau, which literally means game of the stick, is wrongly known as being a Portuguese stick fencing art. I consider that Jogo do Pau isn't a staff exclusive fencing martial art, and much less a Portuguese exclusive martial art.
So Louis, if it's not exclusively Portuguese, where else is it found?
I was fortunate to learn Jogo do Pau in Portugal from the master Nuno Crovelo Russo, who is regarded as the most knowledgeable person probably ever within this art. He's an amazing individual who dedicated his whole life to the study, research and practice of this art. And back in the 70s, he lived for a couple of years in France, and while there he met an individual called Maurice Sarry. And Maurice Sarry was also a very dedicated practitioner and highly respected one of a French art which went by the same name, Jeu du Bâton. And as these two instructors started training together, they realized that all their techniques, all their technical foundations, their striking technique, their pairing technique, and their footwork were exactly the same. Based on this, I consider that this is a type of European historical fencing which simply ended up being preserved in Portugal, but it wasn't exclusive of Portugal.
What is the basis for Jogo do Pau?
There are references in documents, such as in Portuguese King Dom Duarte's book from the 15th century. Within this book, the king described the main striking techniques in terms of trajectory of the strikes and also the names of the strikes, the main striking techniques to be performed with swords. And both the names of the strikes that the king presents and the actual trajectories which he describes within his book 500 years ago to be used when fighting with swords are exactly the same names and trajectories which nowadays are still used within Jogo do Pau. And so my interpretation is that this system corresponds to the historical fencing system which was used in battlefields to fight in outnumbered scenarios, both with swords and staffs. The art ended up being preserved through the staff because it was the weapon, the tool which poor civilians in Portugal had access to. But originally it was an art used with both tools, with both fighting tools, both swords and staffs, but simply ended up being preserved through staffs.
So Louis, you would say that this art, which is basis is in the use of the two-handed sword, could have been used with any of the two-handed sword styles found in Europe at the time?
Yeah, Lee, that's a very, very interesting question, and basically it boils down to one very simple variable, which is the length of the swords. And so obviously that if for those who use swords which are 1 meter and 30 long, these swords allow for practitioners, for combatants to develop momentum and power using shorter range of motions. But we have to keep in mind that before fencing started being focused more around dueling, and as a sport and leisure activity, it was mostly used as a tool to fight in battlefields. And in battlefields, we have to realize that many opponents wore body armor, chainmail, and most or many long swords used within battlefields were 1 meter and 50 centimeters long. And that extra length and mass entails that these weapons are heavier and more difficult to place in motion against opponents using body armor, and thus the system that results from them is a system more focused on wider range of motions, full rotational strikes, which makes it applicable to both staffs and long swords.
So today, when we film this video, how are we going to show the correlation between the longsword, the staff, and the two-handed sword we all refer to as the Montante?
I consider that before the creation of firearms, swords were mostly focused and geared for battlefields. And within that battlefield context, people are mostly engaged in fighting against multiple opponents coming from all sorts of directions. And so that's how we're going to start. We're going to start by looking, analyzing the main foundations, the main concepts of fighting in outnumbered scenarios, how those combat conditions force combatants to develop certain types of parries, and then from that point we'll move on to the specific analysis of single combat, and we'll be looking at how the different sets of affordances and constraints of single combat promoted the development of different pairing techniques. Upon being faced with multiple opponents, one strategy many people try to use is to try to line up their opponents. But this is only successful if our opponents passively allow us to line them up. What happens in a real circumstance is that as I try to line them up, my opponents compensate and don't allow me to achieve that strategy. When fighting multiple opponents, the main thing, the first principle that we should follow is to avoid staying put on the same spot. Because if we do that, what will happen will be that both my opponents will approach at the same time, and I will at best parry myself from one of them, but at the same time I'm already being hit by the other opponent. In order to successfully handle multiple opponents, attacking us, engaging us simultaneously, we need to use both pairing with the weapon and distance. And so, instead of staying put on the same spot, as one opponent attacks us, we sweep his strike and we counterattack him, so that we push him away with the counterattack, at the same time that we step outside of the other attacker's striking reach. And now, as the opposite opponent approaches us and also attacks us, we perform the same thing. And using this strategy, we're able to push one opponent away at the same time that we step outside of the other opponent's, the other attacker's striking reach. As we're fighting multiple opponents and using this strategy, we finish the strike towards one opponent, and what this entails is that we need to bring the weapon across to the opposite side in order to parry ourselves from the opposite opponent. The momentum that I generate by moving my weapon from one opponent to the other is enough to be able to sweep through the opponent's weapon. We're not limited to parry using. Upon being faced with combat scenarios against only one opponent, combatants who were trained in fighting against multiple opponents and thus using sweeping in motion parries, many started using these waiting guards with the weapon pointing backwards. And from these waiting guards, the way they performed parries and counterattacks was the following. Upon being attacked towards the head on the opposite side of the weapon, they would sweep through the strike and follow through, have the momentum following them through with a counter-attack on the opposite side. So the same thing, a little bit faster. 1 and 2. Now, upon being attacked towards the head on the same side on their weapon, exactly, again, they would use an upward parry and follow through with an uppercut on the opposite side due to the moment, the weapon, the parry's momentum. Now, when being attacked with uppercuts, first on the opposite side of the guard, the parry is also a side parry, but downwards, and a counter-attack on the opposite side, due to the parry's momentum. The fourth and last option, being attacked with an uppercut on the guard's side.
Lewis, is there a guard similar to this commonly depicted German guard?
That's an interesting question, Lee, but actually no. In Lusitanian fencing, we only resort to 2 types of waiting guards. The forward pointing waiting guard and these clearly backward pointing waiting guards. We don't use these guards which are more or less halfway between them, because the thing is that the staff doesn't have a blade. But even regarding swords, we consider that this art, or that the staff fencing art, which still exists nowadays, is a preservation of the type of fencing which was used in battlefields. In battlefields, most combatants who had the means to carry swords and use swords for combat also had the means to use chainmail and body armor. And against such opponents, and especially using these types of swords which have significant mass, you can feel for yourself, they aren't very easy to accelerate. Performing strikes with these types of really long swords from this position aren't able to generate enough power to stop an aggressive opponent who is wearing body armor and chainmail. And so in order to face those opponents, this type of fencing focused more on power generation. That's why within Lusitan fencing, we perform full rotational strikes from these guards, or half rotational strikes, which by being released from back here and with the added energy from the body's rotation, are still able to generate enough momentum and power to face such opponents in a battlefield. But the thing is that it depends on the combat scenario, on your opponent's characteristics. If you happen to be using one of those guards and facing an opponent who feeds you full rotational strikes, then okay, yes, that makes sense. Against a full rotational strike, you have enough time to react with that half rotational parry. But if we both happen to use these same backward pointing waiting guards, it is dangerous, because you take the initiative towards my head, and chances are that you're going to hit my arms as I'm trying to pull off the parry. Eventually, some people consider that it is safer to pull off these strategies with swords, because the crossguard is used as an extra safety device. And so I can eventually react with a good enough timing to use the parry to safeguard my hands. But the problem is that if our opponent performs an undercut, we react to his strike, and he is able to easily circumvent our crossguard and take and hit our forearms, our wrists, our hands as we're trying to parry.
Lewis, with the waiting guards and rotational strikes found in Lusitanian fencing, how do you feel this fits into the greater scheme of tournaments in HEMA?
That's another good question, Lee. But in order to answer you, we need to reflect on two elements. One, what constitutes an afterblow, and two, how people score points in competitions. And so, the first thing, what constitutes an afterblow? When you feed me a strike, if I try to parry or simply avoid it, then it means that in both these circumstances, my counterattack is released in a second tempo outside of your strike's tempo. And so if I happen to mess up my parry, for example, you strike my legs, I try to parry high, get hit on the legs, and then release my counterattack, you're able to hit me with your strike and protect yourself from the afterblow. And so I consider that it makes martial sense to force competitors to be responsible for protecting themselves from the afterblow. But now my problem is that when we both start from this situation, you release a strike and I immediately react with a strike of my own, which is what I see many combatants doing, then that doesn't constitute an afterblow because I'm not even trying to parry your strike nor avoid it. And so this doesn't constitute an afterblow. And so now let's imagine that you perform an uppercut towards my hands. In a real situation, I wouldn't even be able to sustain the strike towards my hands and still finish my strike. And so, well, bottom line, what I consider is that it doesn't make martial sense for combatants to react to strikes.
Well, this is the end of our video. Thank you for watching. We would like to make a special thank you to Purple Heart Armory, Natasha and Christian Darcy, for providing us with these great training tools.
And thanks a lot for the attention. Hope this is useful. And as a very special thanks to Blood and Iron, Lee Smith, Jesse Tucker, for having shown the interest to put together this DVD.